Welcome to Shatter.
Help me reach 5,000 subscribers. Support the video with a like and leave your thoughts in the comments. She said it at dinner like it was a TED Talk, not a marriage. We were at Starbucks Reserve, her favorite spot for deep conversations. She leaned back, sipped her flat white, and said, "You're not entitled to my body." I remember the way her voice didn't shake. It wasn't anger. It was control. I looked at her for a few seconds, not as my wife, but as a stranger who had just drawn a line in the middle of our lives. I didn't argue. I just said quietly, "And you're not entitled to my life." Then I went back to my coffee. The silence that followed was colder than the drink between us. That moment didn't break me. It clarified everything. She'd been using distance as currency for months, affection as leverage, silence as proof of strength. She'd learned to talk about boundaries and emotional maturity like they were shields. I used to think she was protecting herself. Now I realized she was just protecting her power. Lately, she'd started spending more time with a guy named Daniel, a therapist she called her professional friend. He understood feminine energy. He helped her explore herself. They met every Thursday, usually at the same cafe, under the same excuse. Once, I passed by after a long shift at the hospital. I saw them through the window, her laughing in a way I hadn't seen in months, his hand lightly touching her wrist as he explained something. It wasn't cheating, not technically, but it was absence. And absence can be louder than betrayal. I saved lives for a living. Broken bones, open wounds. I knew what damage looked like. But this was different. She was bleeding out our connection slowly, one boundary at a time, smiling while she did it. That night, when I came home, she was on her MacBook, typing some post about self-worth for her LinkedIn followers. I stood there for a moment, watching her write words about strength while the marriage she lived in was collapsing from silence. She didn't even look up. I walked to the window, saw my reflection, and thought, "You fix bodies, Mark. Maybe it's time to stop trying to heal what doesn't want to live." That was the last night I tried to reach her. I didn't know it then, but she'd just taught me the easiest way to disappear, not by leaving, but by no longer showing up. The first sign came from someone else. One of the nurses at the hospital, Olivia, mentioned she'd seen my wife having lunch with that therapist again. "They looked close," she said carefully, like she didn't want to get involved. I didn't ask for details. I didn't need them. When someone you love stops seeing you, you start noticing how easily others do. At home, the air felt rehearsed. Every conversation was a performance, her lines perfectly measured, mine trimmed down to silence. She called it emotional space. I called it distance. She spent hours talking about alignment, self-actualization, her healing work. It wasn't that she cheated. It was that she replaced intimacy with theory. When she didn't want to touch me, she said, "I'm protecting my energy." When she didn't want to talk, she said, "I'm processing." I started realizing her vocabulary had become her defense system, every word a locked door. The real shift came one night after a double shift at the ER. I walked in, exhausted, and saw her video calling Daniel from her office. Candles from Whole Foods flickered on her desk, and she was smiling, barefoot, laughing softly. She didn't notice me standing in the doorway. She was talking about trauma responses, about reclaiming her body. I wasn't angry. I just felt something inside me stop. Like a light went out. I didn't confront her. I just walked to the kitchen, opened the fridge, and realized even the food was organized around her new routines. Almond milk, green juice, supplements lined up like soldiers. My beer was gone. My space was gone. I didn't belong in that house anymore. I was just an object in the background of her enlightenment. She came out of the office hours later and said, "You're quiet again." I almost laughed. Quiet was all that was left between us. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in the dark, watching the headlights move across the ceiling, and thought about how strange it is when someone you love slowly rebrands their distance as growth. By sunrise, I'd made my decision. I wasn't going to argue or plead. I'd been fixing what was broken my whole life. But this wasn't broken. It was finished. I started noticing the small clues first. A second phone charger appeared on her side of the bed. A receipt from Starbucks Reserve folded neatly inside her planner. It wasn't evidence of betrayal. It was proof of absence. The kind of absence that moves quietly, changing everything without announcing itself. She used to ask about my patience, my nights on call, my exhaustion. Now she barely looked up from her screen. Her LinkedIn feed had replaced our conversations. She posted about self-sufficiency and energy protection, collecting likes from people who thought she was brave. One night, I checked our joint account to cover a medical supply order. Half the balance was gone. She'd transferred it to her coaching business. Temporary, she said later, when she noticed I'd seen it. I didn't argue. I just nodded. Something in me had shifted. I started studying her behavior like a trauma case. Calmly, clinically, already knowing the prognosis. Over the next week, I gathered quiet facts. I looked through shared files, bills, the lease. She didn't notice. Her focus was somewhere else, in conversations that made her feel seen. Every time I came home, the house smelled of essential oils and detachment. She had built her new identity right in front of me, convinced I would stay as a silent witness. I stopped leaving my things around. My keys, my stethoscope, my watch, all began disappearing from their usual places, one by one. It wasn't a conscious plan at first, it was instinct. Detachment isn't always loud. Sometimes it's just the slow erasure of presence. A few nights later, she sat beside me on the couch and said she felt energetically disconnected. I remember the flicker of pride in her eyes, as if the words themselves proved how evolved she was. I looked at her and thought, you're diagnosing yourself while the patient next to you is already gone. When she went to sleep, I opened my laptop and canceled our shared utilities. Quiet, efficient, surgical. The same way I'd close a wound that couldn't heal. The hum of the fridge was the only sound left in that house, and even that felt temporary. By the time she woke up the next morning, something invisible had already ended. I disappeared on a Wednesday morning. No arguments, no explanations, just silence. She thought I'd left early for the hospital, but by the time she finished her morning meditation, I was already miles away. My Chevy Tahoe was packed the night before, documents, essentials, my medical equipment, and a box of everything that was truly mine. The rest I left behind like a museum of what used to matter. I drove through the still dark streets, passing the familiar Starbucks reserve where she used to meet him. The lights were off, chairs stacked. It looked peaceful, empty in a way that finally made sense to me. I stopped for a moment at the intersection, watching the city wake up, and felt nothing. Not anger, not regret. Just the quiet relief of leaving a story that had already ended. Before I pulled onto the highway, I sent her one message. You said it's your journey. I won't block the road. Then I turned off my phone. No location sharing, no social media, no trace. Just distance, clean and final. By noon, my accounts were separated, cards canceled, and my new position at another trauma center was confirmed. It felt surgical, controlled, almost clinical. Every cut necessary, every stitch precise. I didn't delete her photos or burn the memories. I just stopped carrying them. That's how you truly disappear, not by hiding, but by refusing to be reachable. Later that evening, I imagined her walking through the house, realizing the small things first. The missing stethoscope, the empty dresser, the silence of a phone that wouldn't ring back. She would think I was angry. She would be wrong. Anger is still a form of attachment. What I felt was absence, pure and complete. As I crossed state lines, I rolled down the window and let the cold air hit my face. It felt like oxygen after months underwater. Somewhere behind me, she was probably opening her laptop, drafting a post about losing people who can't handle your boundaries. Maybe she'd even believe it. But the truth was simpler. She hadn't lost me. She'd trained me to leave quietly. It didn't take long for the ripple to reach her. Within days, I started hearing about it through mutual friends. Her professional friend, Daniel, the therapist she'd leaned on, had been quietly investigated for unethical client relationships. One of her coaching partners mentioned it during a hospital fundraiser, not knowing the connection. I didn't react. I just listened. His reputation was unraveling, not because of me, but because truth doesn't stay buried when it's built on manipulation. A week before I left, I'd noticed his name on one of her shared invoices. They'd used the same consulting platform to exchange coaching payments. I didn't expose it. I simply forwarded the documents to the proper licensing board, anonymously, attached with the note. Potential conflict of interest between therapist and client. Then I let silence do the rest. Now, while I was settling into my new position at the trauma center, he was losing clients. She was losing credibility. Her entire brand was built on connection, and suddenly she looked like someone who'd blurred every line she claimed to protect. I didn't celebrate it. I just watched from a distance, as if observing a slow, natural collapse. I spent my evenings in a small apartment above a clinic, learning what quiet actually felt like. There was no incense, no energy talk, no curated playlists. Just the hum of the fridge and the sound of my own breathing. I ordered a few things from Amazon: a coffee maker, some new scrubs, and a set of cheap plates. Everything was functional, unremarkable, and yet it all felt alive again. One night, I got an email from her, short, formal, like a business memo. She said, "I hope you're doing well. I'm still processing what happened." I read it twice and closed my laptop. There was nothing left to process. Some stories end without closure because closure would only reopen what's already healed. Somewhere out there, she was probably rewriting the narrative, telling herself she'd been abandoned by someone who couldn't handle her growth. But I didn't disappear out of weakness. I disappeared because strength sometimes looks like silence. The first public crack came quietly, almost invisible at first. Someone from her coaching circle commented under one of her videos, asking about the therapist scandal. She deleted it within minutes, but the echo stayed. Soon, more whispers followed, questions about professionalism, boundaries, integrity. The same words she once used like armor now became weapons pointed at her. I saw it all unfold from a distance. Her LinkedIn activity slowed. The likes vanished. The inspirational posts about healing stopped. When I passed through the city a month later, I walked into a Whole Foods for coffee and noticed her on the phone near the checkout. She looked smaller somehow, still polished, still pretending, but the performance had cracks. She was telling someone that people were misinterpreting her truth. It sounded rehearsed, defensive. She didn't see me, and I didn't say a word. Some ghosts belong to silence. I heard through Olivia that her studio lease had been revoked. The rent was overdue, her business accounts frozen after the split. She'd used my name as a guarantor. Not anymore. I'd removed it the week I left. Now, the studio that once smelled of candles and control stood empty, her healing sessions replaced by an eviction notice. What struck me most wasn't her downfall. It was the stillness that followed. When someone builds their world on validation, silence becomes unbearable. I imagined her refreshing her phone, waiting for likes that never came, calls that never arrived. I didn't block her. I didn't need to. The world just stopped orbiting around her, and she had no gravity left. That same night, I opened YouTube and saw her new video in the recommendations. The title said, "When toxic people leave, let them." She was talking to the camera, smiling too much, explaining the cost of emotional detachment. I watched for less than a minute. Her words were polished, but her eyes told a different story. There was panic behind the calm. I closed the laptop and turned off the light. She used to teach people about boundaries. Now she was finally living inside one she couldn't break, mine. Months passed before I heard her name again. It came up during a hospital break, when one of the new residents mentioned a woman running emotional recovery workshops online. I didn't have to ask. I knew. She'd moved her sessions to YouTube, sitting in front of the same ring light she once used for coaching calls, speaking to strangers about resilience. But her views were dropping, her comments section half empty. The world had moved on, and she was still trying to prove she'd healed. By then, I'd built a new rhythm. My days were spent in the trauma bay, my nights at the apartment above the clinic. I'd learned to enjoy silence again. No affirmations, no lectures about alignment, just the quiet weight of reality. Sometimes I'd drive out past the city in my truck, park near the water, and sit there until the sun came up. There was peace in knowing I didn't owe anyone an explanation. One night, I got a text from an unknown number. It was her. The message was short. "Can we talk?" I stared at the screen for a long time. My first instinct was to ignore it. Then I typed one sentence. "There's nothing left to say." I didn't send it. I just deleted the message and blocked the number. That was the difference between who I was and who I'd become. I didn't need to win. I just needed distance. Later, curiosity got the better of me. I searched her name on YouTube. Her latest video had less than 100 views. She was talking about reclaiming identity after abandonment. Her voice trembled slightly near the end. I realized she wasn't talking to her audience. She was talking to herself. The comments were filled with people telling her to stay strong, to let go of toxic energy. I closed the tab and looked around my small apartment. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine, unfiltered, uncurated, real. For the first time in years, I didn't feel small. I didn't feel drained. I just felt free. And freedom, I realized, is the loudest kind of silence. It was almost a year later when our paths crossed again. I was leaving the hospital late one night, and she was there, standing by the entrance, waiting. Her hair was shorter, her clothes simpler, but her eyes carried the same restless energy. She smiled like someone rehearsing normal. I didn't speak at first. The silence between us had aged too much to break easily. She said she'd been working on herself, that she understood things now. Her voice trembled in places where confidence used to live. She told me she never meant to push me away, that she'd just been scared of dependence. I listened quietly, the way I used to listen to patients describing old pain, without judgment, but also without illusion. She said she missed my steadiness, the feeling of safety I brought. I told her I was glad she was finding clarity. Nothing more. No bitterness, no satisfaction, just calm. She searched my face for something, anger, regret, softness, but there was none left. The man she used to manage through silence had learned to live inside it. She tried to make light conversation, asking if I still drove the same car, if I'd moved far. I nodded. I could feel her trying to rebuild a bridge that no longer had ground on either side. Eventually, she said, "You look different. Happier." I said, "I am." It wasn't a performance, it was the truth. Before she left, she asked if we could meet again, just to talk, as friends. I didn't say yes or no. I just looked at her and said, "Take care of yourself." Then I turned and walked back inside. I didn't look back. That night, I sat in my apartment and thought about how strange it is, the way some people return only when they feel the absence they created. She thought closure meant conversation. For me, closure had been silence. Out there, she was still trying to explain what went wrong. But explanations belonged to the ones still hoping. I wasn't hoping. I was already gone. After that night, she began reaching out more often. Emails, short messages, sometimes voice notes that I never opened. Each one sounded like an echo from a place I no longer lived. The more she reached, the quieter I became. That's the thing about silence. It grows roots. It becomes your language when words have already failed. A few weeks later, I heard she'd closed her coaching business completely. The fallout from her past connections had caught up with her. Daniel's license had been suspended, and his clients started speaking out. She wasn't accused of anything directly, but proximity has a cost. The same people who once called her authentic now called her performative. It wasn't revenge, it was gravity. Everything she'd built on illusion had simply fallen back to earth. I didn't take any satisfaction in it. If anything, it made me strangely sad. She'd always been chasing the idea of control, trying to feel powerful by withholding, defining, labeling. But power built on fear never lasts. And when she ran out of ways to withhold, she had nothing left to give. One afternoon, she sent a package to my work address. Inside was a small box, no note. Just the silver ring I'd given her when things were still good. It wasn't expensive, just simple, honest. I held it in my hand for a while, then placed it in my drawer without emotion. Some things don't need closure, they just need distance. That evening, I went for a drive. The road was quiet, the kind of stillness you can feel in your chest. For the first time, I realized I wasn't angry, not even guarded. I just didn't care anymore. She'd become a story that ended naturally, without climax, without drama. When I stopped for gas, I saw her video pop up on YouTube again. "How to rebuild after losing yourself," it said. I smiled, not in mockery, but in understanding. She finally knew what loss meant. Not losing me, but losing the version of herself that once believed control was love. That was the night I stopped remembering her as someone who hurt me. I started remembering her as someone who taught me how to leave without noise. It was almost 2 years later when I saw her again. Not in person, on a screen. Someone at the hospital sent me a link to a new video she'd posted on YouTube. The title said, "When Silence Teaches You Everything." For a moment, I hesitated to click. Then curiosity won. She sat in a small room, no candles, no filters, no stage lighting. Just a woman and a camera. Her voice was slower now, stripped of the confidence she once used to disguise control. She talked about losing connection, about how boundaries had become walls. She said sometimes strength isn't about holding back. It's about letting go before there's nothing left to save. She didn't say my name, but every word was a mirror. I didn't feel pride or pity, just stillness. Because in that moment, I realized she'd finally met the silence I'd left her with and learned to live inside it. It had taken her everything she owned to understand what I'd known the night I drove away. Distance isn't cruelty. It's clarity. After watching, I closed the laptop and stepped outside. The evening air was cool, the city lights soft against the horizon. My phone buzzed with messages from colleagues, weekend plans, normal life. The kind that doesn't need constant repair. I got into the car and sat there for a while, thinking about how far we'd both come. She had her lessons. I had my peace. There was no debt left between us. Some endings don't require words. They just demand presence, then absence. Before starting the engine, I remembered her first line at Starbucks Reserve all those years ago. "You're not entitled to my body." I smiled faintly and whispered, not to her, but to myself, "And you were never entitled to my life." Then I started the car and drove home. Not away from something, but toward everything that waited beyond her silence. I didn't disappear. I just stopped showing up where I wasn't respected. Support the channel by liking, commenting, and subscribing. I promise even more interesting stories.